They thought the certified letter was a mistake, just another bill they couldn't afford to ignore. But when Harold and Dorothy walked through those mansion doors, they had no idea the secret buried beneath their feet would be worth $260 million, change their lives forever, and force them to make a choice that would echo across the world. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning air in Greenfield, Pennsylvania, carried the kind of chill that settles into old bones and refuses to leave. Harold Mitchell stood at the kitchen window of their second-floor apartment, watching frost cling to the edges of the glass like tiny diamonds. He was 73 years old, with hands that still bore the calluses from 38 years at the Riverside manufacturing plant, and shoulders that curved slightly forward from decades of assembly line work. His hair had gone completely white 5 years ago, but his eyes, pale blue and steady, still held the sharpness of a man who'd learned to fix problems with patience and precision. Behind him, Dorothy hummed softly as she measured coffee grounds into their old percolator. At 71, she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd learned to navigate a body that didn't quite respond the way it used to. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the same cardigan she'd owned for 15 years, soft blue with patches at the elbows she'd mended herself. She'd spent 42 years as a librarian at Greenfield Elementary, reading to children who would later grow up and bring their own kids to sit in the same circle where she'd once taught their parents. They'd been married 52 years. 52 years of shared coffee in the morning, hands held across dinner tables, and whispered conversations in the dark when one of them couldn't sleep. Their apartment was small, just 900 square feet, but it was clean and filled with the kind of humble treasures that come from a life lived simply. Crocheted blankets Dorothy had made, a collection of old books with worn spines, photographs of their daughter Rebecca on every available surface. Rebecca lived in Seattle now, 2,300 miles away, with a husband and 2 teenagers who video called every Sunday evening. Harold and Dorothy never complained about the distance, but the truth lived in the way Dorothy's face lit up when that call came through, or the way Harold kept his phone charged and within reach at all times, just in case. Money had always been tight, but lately it had gotten tighter. Harold's pension barely covered rent, and Dorothy's Social Security check disappeared into medical bills faster than either of them wanted to admit. Harold's heart medication cost $217 a month, even with insurance. Dorothy's arthritis medication was another $183. They'd learned to stretch a dollar further than most people thought possible. Chicken could last 3 meals if you were creative. Generic brands tasted just fine. And honestly, they didn't need much. But some nights, Harold would sit at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, and Dorothy would see the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when the numbers didn't add up the way he needed them to. She never said anything. She'd just make him a cup of tea, sit beside him, and place her hand over his until his breathing slowed. They were surviving, barely, but surviving nonetheless. That Tuesday morning in late September started like every other. Harold made toast while Dorothy poured coffee. They sat at their small Formica table and shared sections of the newspaper, a ritual they'd maintained for decades. Harold read the sports section even though he'd stopped caring about baseball years ago. Dorothy scanned the obituaries, a habit she'd developed after turning 70, checking to see which classmates or former colleagues had passed. The knock on the door came at 8:47. Harold looked up, frowning. They never got visitors this early. Dorothy set down her coffee cup and glanced toward the door like it might bite. "Probably those kids selling candy bars again," Harold muttered, pushing himself up from the chair with a small grunt. But it wasn't kids. It was a postal worker in uniform, holding a clipboard and a large manila envelope that looked far too official to be anything good. Harold Mitchell? The woman asked. That's me. Certified letter, need your signature. Harold signed where she pointed, his handwriting shaky. The woman handed him the envelope and left without another word. He stood in the doorway, staring down at the return address. Brennan, Foster and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Dorothy appeared at his shoulder. What is it? Don't know yet. They sat back down at the kitchen table. Harold turned the envelope over twice before finally tearing it open. Inside was a letter on heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that felt expensive between your fingers. Dorothy leaned closer as Harold read aloud, his voice uncertain. Dear Mr. Mitchell, I am writing to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Cornelius James Mitchell, who died on August 14th of this year. As the sole surviving heir named in his last will and testament, you are entitled to receive his entire estate. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of this inheritance and the necessary legal procedures. Sincerely, Marcus Brennan, Executor of Estate. Silence filled the kitchen. Harold read it again, silently this time, his lips moving slightly. Uncle Cornelius, Dorothy whispered. Harold, you never mentioned an Uncle Cornelius. Barely knew him, Harold said slowly, setting the letter down like it might explode. My father's older brother. Met him maybe twice when I was a kid. He came to our house once when I was 8 or 9, stayed for dinner, never said much. Then showed up at my father's funeral 30 years ago, shook my hand and left. That was it. Dorothy picked up the letter, scanning it herself. It says entire estate. Probably means some old furniture and a couple thousand in the bank, Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. People don't just inherit fortunes. This has to be a scam. Harold, it's from a law firm. Law firms can be scams too. But Dorothy was already moving toward the bedroom, returning moments later with her reading glasses and the cordless phone. We're calling, right now. Harold wanted to argue, but he'd learned over 52 years that when Dorothy made that face, the decision was already made. She dialed the number printed at the top of the letter. Harold listened to one side of the conversation, watching Dorothy's expression shift from skeptical to confused to something he couldn't quite read. Yes, this is Dorothy Mitchell, Harold's wife. We received a letter this morning about an inheritance. Yes, I'll hold. She covered the mouthpiece and whispered, They're pulling up the file. A long minute passed. Then Dorothy straightened, her eyes going wide. Yes, I'm here. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And when did he pass? I see. And the estate is located where? I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Full legal ownership, within 30 days. Yes, we can come in. Tomorrow at 2, we'll be there. Thank you. She hung up slowly, staring at Harold like she'd just witnessed something impossible. Well? Harold demanded. Dorothy sat down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Harold, your Uncle Cornelius lived in a mansion in Willow Heights. The attorney said the property alone is worth over $10 million. Harold's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table. Lukewarm coffee spread across the newspaper. Neither of them moved to clean it up. That can't be right, Harold said. He said we need to come in tomorrow to sign papers and discuss the details. Harold, we have to take legal possession within 30 days, or the estate goes to the state. They sat in stunned silence, the kitchen clock ticking loudly above them. 10 million, Harold repeated, his voice hollow. Dorothy reached across the table and gripped his hand. Her palm was ice cold. That night, neither of them slept much. They lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, occasionally whispering questions neither could answer. Who was Cornelius really? Why would he leave everything to Harold? What did this mean for them? For Rebecca? Could they even handle something this big? By morning, they'd decided to at least go to the meeting. They could walk away if it felt wrong. They could say no. They weren't obligated to accept anything. But deep down, both of them knew they wouldn't walk away. The drive to Harrisburg took 2 hours in their 1998 Ford station wagon. The car had 218,000 miles on it, a crack in the windshield Harold kept meaning to fix, and a passenger door that squeaked every time Dorothy opened it. They'd bought it used 15 years ago, and Harold had maintained it meticulously, changing the oil every 3,000 miles like clockwork. As they merged onto the highway, Harold gripped the steering wheel tight enough that his knuckles went white. Dorothy sat beside him, her purse clutched in her lap, watching Pennsylvania farmland blur past the window. "What if it's real?" she finally asked. "What if it's not?" Harold countered. Neither had a good answer. The law office of Brennan, Foster and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a modern glass building in downtown Harrisburg. The elevator was newer than anything in their apartment. The receptionist smiled at them with teeth too white to be natural and offered coffee they were too nervous to drink. Marcus Brennan was younger than they expected, maybe 45, with dark hair graying at the temples and a suit that probably cost more than their rent. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes were kind. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I know this must be quite a shock." "That's putting it mildly," Harold said. They sat in leather chairs across from his massive desk. Marcus pulled out a thick folder and opened it carefully. "Let me start by expressing my condolences. Cornelius Mitchell passed away peacefully in his sleep on August 14th. He was 87 years old." "We barely knew him," Dorothy admitted. "I gathered as much from his files," Marcus said gently. "Cornelius was, by all accounts, an extremely private man. He had no children, never married, and maintained very few social connections. But he was very specific in his will. You, Mr. Mitchell, are his only living relative and his sole heir." Harold swallowed hard. The letter mentioned an estate. "Yes." Marcus pulled out several documents. "Cornelius owned a mansion in Willow Heights, about 90 minutes from here. The property sits on 12 acres of land. The house itself is approximately 18,000 square feet." Dorothy made a small sound in the back of her throat. "The property was appraised last year at $12,300,000. That's just the real estate. There are also financial assets, though Cornelius lived quite modestly despite his wealth. His liquid assets total approximately $850,000 across various accounts." Harold felt dizzy. The numbers were too big, too impossible. "How?" he managed. "How did he get all this?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Cornelius made his fortune in acquisitions. He worked as a private dealer for very wealthy clients, helping them acquire rare items, art, antiques, that sort of thing. He was extremely successful and extremely discreet, but he lived simply. The mansion was his one extravagance." "Why Harold?" Dorothy asked. "Why leave everything to someone he barely spoke to?" "That, I'm afraid, I cannot answer," Marcus said. "Cornelius didn't share his reasoning with me, but his will is ironclad. Everything goes to Harold Mitchell upon one condition." "Here it comes," Harold muttered. "You must take legal possession of the property within 30 days of his death. That means you have 18 days left to claim the estate. If you fail to do so, everything reverts to the state." "And if we accept it?" Dorothy asked. "Then it's yours, all of it. I'll handle all the paperwork, transfer of deed, financial accounts, everything. You'll own one of the most impressive properties in Pennsylvania." Harold and Dorothy looked at each other, having an entire conversation without words. "Can we see it?" Harold finally asked. "The house?" "I was hoping you'd ask," Marcus said, standing. "I can take you there right now if you'd like." 30 minutes later, they were following Marcus's sleek black sedan in their rattling station wagon, driving through neighborhoods that got progressively more impressive. The houses grew larger, the lawns more manicured, the cars in driveways more expensive. Dorothy pressed her face close to the window, taking it all in. "Harold, look at that one. It's got columns." "They've all got columns," Harold said, his voice tight. Then Marcus's turn signal came on, and they followed him through a set of massive iron gates that swung open automatically. The driveway was paved with smooth grey stone and curved through perfectly maintained grounds. Ancient oak trees lined the path, their branches creating a canopy overhead. And then they saw it. The mansion rose before them like something out of a movie, all stone and glass and impossible grandeur. It was 3 stories tall, with wings extending on either side. Massive windows reflected the afternoon sun. Ivy climbed the walls in carefully managed patterns. Stone lions flanked the front steps. "Oh my God," Dorothy whispered. Harold said nothing. He couldn't. They parked beside Marcus's car and climbed out slowly, both of them staring up at the structure with identical expressions of shock. An elderly man emerged from a side entrance, thin and dignified in pressed slacks and a cardigan. His hair was pure white, his face lined with deep wrinkles, but his posture was perfectly straight. "This is Vincent," Marcus explained. "He's been the estate caretaker for 43 years. Vincent, these are the new owners, Harold and Dorothy Mitchell." Vincent approached them slowly, studying their faces with sharp grey eyes. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "Mr. Cornelius said his nephew would come," Vincent said in a voice that carried a faint accent Dorothy couldn't place. "He said you'd have his eyes." Harold blinked. "He talked about me." "Only once, near the end. He said you were a good man who worked hard all his life. He said you'd know what to do." "Know what to do with what?" Harold asked. Vincent's smile faded slightly. "That, I'm afraid, is not for me to say. But come, let me show you your inheritance." He produced an old brass key from his pocket and approached the massive front door. It was made of dark wood, carved with intricate patterns, taller than any door Harold had ever seen. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung open without a sound. What lay beyond stole their breath. The entry hall was enormous, easily 40 feet across, with a ceiling that soared 3 stories high. A crystal chandelier the size of their kitchen table hung from the center, catching light and scattering it in rainbow patterns across marble floors so polished they looked like glass. A curved staircase swept up to the second floor, its banister gleaming dark wood carved with such detail it looked like lace. Paintings lined the walls, not prints, but originals in gilded frames. Sculptures stood on pedestals. Fresh flowers sat in vases taller than Dorothy. "This isn't real," Dorothy whispered. "This can't be real." But it was. Vincent led them through room after room, each more impressive than the last. A formal living room with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. A dining room with a table that could seat 20. A kitchen with appliances Dorothy had only seen in magazines. A conservatory filled with plants and comfortable seating. A library that made Dorothy gasp aloud. The library was 2 stories tall, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. Ladders on rails allowed access to the upper shelves. Plush reading chairs sat beside tall windows. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air. 28 rooms in total, Vincent explained, not counting bathrooms or storage. Mr. Cornelius used perhaps 6 of them regularly. "Where did he sleep?" Harold asked. "A modest bedroom on the 2nd floor. I'll show you." They climbed the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing. The 2nd floor was just as overwhelming, bedroom after bedroom, each decorated differently, each untouched. Cornelius's room was at the end of the east wing. When Vincent opened the door, both Harold and Dorothy were surprised. It was simple, almost sparse. A queen bed with plain linens, a single dresser, a chair by the window, a small desk with a lamp. "He didn't care for luxury?" Dorothy asked. "He cared for privacy," Vincent said carefully, "and security." "Security from what?" Harold asked. Vincent didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked to a bookshelf and ran his fingers along the spines. "Mr. Cornelius had many secrets. Some he shared with me, others he took to his grave. He made me promise to let you discover certain things on your own." "What things?" Harold pressed. You'll know when you find them." Vincent turned to face them. "I should mention, several doors in this house are locked. Mr. Cornelius had his reasons. The keys are somewhere in the house, but he never told me where." Dorothy and Harold exchanged glances. "Why?" Dorothy asked. "Why lock doors in your own home?" "Because some things," Vincent said softly, "are too valuable to leave unguarded." They continued the tour, but Harold's mind was elsewhere now. He started noticing things, doors that didn't quite match the others, walls that seemed thicker than they needed to be. Vincent's careful choice of words. The basement contained a workshop that looked like it belonged to a master craftsman. Tools hung in perfect order. Workbenches stood clean and organized. But there was dust on everything, suggesting no one had worked here in years. "Your uncle was skilled with his hands," Vincent said. "He restored many things." Harold ran his fingers over a pristine set of chisels. He understood tools, understood men who worked with their hands. For the first time since entering the mansion, he felt a connection to Cornelius. By the time they finished the tour, the sun was setting. Golden light poured through the tall windows, painting everything in warm amber tones. Marcus had been waiting in the entry hall, reviewing paperwork. "So," he said as they descended the stairs, "what do you think?" "I think," Harold said slowly, "that I don't understand any of this." "You don't have to understand it," Marcus replied. "You just have to decide if you want it." Dorothy spoke up, her voice stronger than Harold expected. "Can we stay here tonight, just to think?" Marcus nodded. "Of course. Vincent can show you which rooms are prepared for guests." After Marcus left, Vincent led them to a bedroom on the second floor. It was beautiful but not ostentatious. A 4-poster bed with soft quilts, a sitting area with comfortable chairs, and a bathroom larger than their entire apartment bedroom. "There's food in the kitchen," Vincent said. "Mr. Cornelius kept the house stocked. I live in the cottage on the property, about 200 yards that way." He gestured toward the east. "If you need anything at all, there's an intercom system. Press the red button in any room." "Thank you," Dorothy said. "Vincent, did Mr. Cornelius ever talk about why he chose Harold?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "He said family wasn't about how often you saw someone. It was about who carried the same blood, the same values. He said he watched you from a distance, Mr. Mitchell. He knew you were a good man who'd worked hard all your life and stayed honest. That's all he wanted in an heir." After Vincent left, Harold and Dorothy stood in the center of the bedroom, surrounded by more luxury than they'd seen in their entire lives combined. "What do we do?" Dorothy whispered. "I don't know," Harold admitted. "But I think we need to understand what we're really inheriting before we decide." They ate a simple dinner in the massive kitchen, feeling ridiculous sitting at a table meant for a dozen people. Then, as darkness fell and the mansion settled into deep quiet, they began to explore. Dorothy was drawn immediately back to the library. She ran her fingers along book spines, reading titles in the dim light. Many were first editions. Some were in languages she didn't recognize. And there, on a reading table, she found something that made her breath catch. A journal, leather-bound, old but well-maintained. She opened it carefully. The first page read, "Private Diary of Cornelius James Mitchell." "Harold," she called softly. He appeared in the doorway and she held up the journal. They sat together in the plush reading chairs, and Dorothy began to read aloud by lamplight. The entries were dated, starting from 1962. Cornelius wrote about his work, about acquiring rare pieces for wealthy clients, about his travels. But he also wrote about loneliness, about choosing solitude over connection, about building this mansion as both sanctuary and prison. And then, 20 pages in, Dorothy found an entry that made her stop. "What?" Harold asked. "What is it?" She read, "I've completed the chamber today. 7 years of construction, done in secret even from Vincent. Everything is secure. The collection is protected. I only pray that when the time comes, whoever finds it will understand what I've done and why. Some things are too important to trust to institutions. Some things need to wait for the right person." Harold leaned forward. "Chamber? What chamber?" They looked at each other in the soft glow of the library lamp. Somewhere in this mansion, Cornelius had hidden something. Something he'd spent 7 years building a secret chamber to protect. And they had 18 days to decide if they wanted to find it. What happens next will turn this inheritance upside down, reveal a truth that's been buried for decades, and force Harold and Dorothy to make a choice that could change history itself. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Dorothy couldn't stop reading. She sat curled in the leather chair, the journal resting on her lap, turning pages with careful reverence. Harold had fallen asleep in the chair beside her sometime after midnight, his soft snoring the only sound in the vast library. But Dorothy kept reading, kept searching for answers in Cornelius's precise handwriting. The entries painted a picture of a man consumed by purpose. Cornelius wrote about acquiring pieces for clients, but his language was strange, protective, almost possessive. He didn't call them purchases, he called them rescues. Dorothy found an entry from 1978 that made her sit up straighter. "Today I secured another piece that would have disappeared into a private collection, never to be seen again. The world believes it was destroyed in the fire of 1943. Better they continue believing. Some things are safer hidden than displayed. The chamber grows." She flipped ahead, looking for more references. There were dozens, scattered across decades. "Added 3 pieces to the chamber today. The authentication took months, but I'm certain now." And later, "Vincent asked about the construction noise. Told him I was reinforcing the foundation. Not entirely a lie. And then, from 1989, the chamber is nearly complete. 27 pieces secured. I've spent my entire fortune protecting what the world has forgotten." Dorothy's hands trembled as she turned another page. Cornelius had been hiding something valuable, something he'd spent his life and money protecting. But what? And where? She glanced at Harold, still sleeping peacefully, then back at the journal. Another entry caught her eye, dated 2003. "Today I received another threat. They've found me again, demanding I reveal the location. I told them what I've told everyone. There is no collection. I'm just an old man in an old house. But they're persistent. I've reinforced the security, changed the codes. The chamber must remain hidden until the right person finds it." Threats. Cornelius had been threatened. Dorothy's stomach tightened. She read for another hour before exhaustion finally won. She marked her page carefully and set the journal on the side table. Then she reached over and touched Harold's arm gently. "Harold, honey, let's go to bed." He startled awake, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where they were. "What time is it?" "Almost 3. They climbed into the enormous bed in their guest room, but neither slept well. Dorothy's mind churned with questions. Harold stared at the ornate ceiling, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Morning came too quickly. Sunlight streamed through windows they'd forgotten to cover. Dorothy woke first and found Harold already dressed, standing at the window overlooking the grounds. "I called Rebecca," he said without turning around. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that we inherited a mansion from my Uncle Cornelius and we don't know what to do." "And?" Harold turned to face her. "She thinks we should sell it immediately. Said we're too old to deal with something this big. Said we should take the money, move to Seattle, help with the grandkids." Dorothy sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "What do you think?" "I think she's probably right. I think this whole thing is too much for 2 people like us." He paused. "But I also think Cornelius left this to me for a reason. and I want to know what it is." Dorothy smiled despite herself. 52 years of marriage had taught her to recognize that stubborn set to Harold's jaw. He'd made up his mind. "Then we figure it out together," she said. They spent the morning exploring more thoroughly, taking notes this time. Dorothy brought the journal with her, reading entries aloud as they moved through rooms. Harold started paying closer attention to the architecture, the way walls connected, the placement of doors. In the conservatory, Dorothy found another journal tucked behind a row of gardening books. This one was older, the leather more worn. The entries dated back to 1960. "Harold, listen to this," she said, sitting on a wrought-iron bench. "I've decided to build the chamber beneath the east wing. The foundation there is deepest, most secure. I'll need to be careful. Construction must be invisible from outside. I've hired contractors from 3 different cities, each working on separate sections. None will know what they're truly building." Harold knelt beside a potted fern, examining the floor. "Dorothy, look at this." She joined him. He'd pulled the fern aside, revealing a small brass plate embedded in the stone floor. It was engraved with a symbol that looked like overlapping circles. "It's the same symbol from the first journal," Dorothy said, excitement rising in her voice. "Remember? He drew it in the margins next to the entry about completing the chamber." They searched the conservatory for more symbols, but found nothing else unusual. Still, it felt like progress, like they were getting closer to understanding. That afternoon, Vincent appeared with lunch on a silver tray, sandwiches, fruit, fresh lemonade. He set it on the dining room table where Harold and Dorothy had spread out papers, journals, and their handwritten notes. "You're searching," Vincent observed. It wasn't a question. "Did you know," Harold asked, "about whatever Cornelius was hiding?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "I knew Mr. Cornelius was a man of secrets. I knew there were rooms I was never shown, areas of the house where I was not permitted. But the specifics—" He shook his head. "He never shared those with me." "He wrote about threats," Dorothy said, "people demanding he reveal a location." Vincent's expression darkened. "Yes, 3 times over the years men came. They were not kind men. Mr. Cornelius always sent them away, but after each visit he would seem troubled for weeks." "When was the last time?" Harold asked. 2011. 2 men in expensive suits. They claimed to represent collectors who believed Mr. Cornelius had acquired certain items illegally. He told them to leave or he would call the police. They left, but not before one of them said, "You can't hide it forever." Dorothy and Harold exchanged glances. "Vincent," Harold said carefully, "if there is something valuable hidden in this house, we need to know, not for the money, but because people might come looking again." "Then perhaps," Vincent said softly, "you should stop looking. Perhaps you should sell this house, take your money and live peacefully. Some secrets are buried for good reason." But even as he said it, they all knew that wasn't going to happen. 2 days later, Marcus Brennan returned with an estate appraiser named Patricia Lowry. She was a severe woman in her 50s with grey hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She carried a leather portfolio and walked through the mansion with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen it all. Harold and Dorothy followed her from room to room, watching as she took photographs, made notes, occasionally pausing to examine something more closely. In the library, she stopped at a wall of books and frowned. "This is interesting," she murmured. "What is?" Dorothy asked. Patricia pulled out a measuring tape and checked something. "This wall, it's nearly 2 feet thicker than the exterior wall suggests it should be." Harold's pulse quickened. "Meaning?" "Meaning there might be something behind it. A closet, perhaps, or a chase for plumbing. But it's unusual." She made a note in her portfolio. Over the next 3 hours, Patricia found 4 more architectural anomalies. Walls that were thicker than necessary. A closet that should have been larger based on the room dimensions. A section of the basement where the ceiling height dropped significantly for no apparent reason. "Mr. Mitchell," she said as they concluded the tour, "I need to be honest with you. This house has been significantly modified from its original structure. I'd need to see the original blueprints to give you an accurate assessment." "Where would we find those?" Harold asked.
"County Records Office. They'd be filed with the building permits."
The next morning, Harold and Dorothy drove to the county offices. It took the clerk 20 minutes to locate the files for the Willow Heights property. She brought them a large rolled blueprint dated 1953, when the house was originally built, and a thick folder of permits. They spread the blueprint across a table in the public viewing area. Dorothy traced her finger along the lines, trying to make sense of it. "Harold, look at this. The east wing. According to this, there should be a storage room here, between the conservatory and the study." "But there's not," Harold said. "There's just wall." They dug through the permits. Most were standard: electrical updates, roof repairs, window replacements. But then Dorothy found something strange. This permit from 1972, it's for foundation reinforcement in the east wing. It shows excavation going down 28 feet. Harold frowned. "Why would you need to go that deep for foundation work?" "You wouldn't," said a voice behind them. They turned to find a man in his 60s, wearing a county employee badge. He'd been filing documents nearby and apparently listening. "Pardon?" Harold said. 28 feet of excavation. That's not foundation work. That's basement expansion or underground construction." The man stepped closer, looking at the permit. "Who owns this property?" "We do," Dorothy said. "We just inherited it." The man whistled low. "Well, somebody built something under that house, and they went to a lot of trouble to make it legal without being specific about what it was. See here? The permit just says structural improvements. No details about what kind of structure." Back at the mansion, Harold and Dorothy stood in the east wing, looking at the walls with new understanding. Somewhere behind this expensive wallpaper and crown molding was access to whatever Cornelius had built. Dorothy had brought both journals. She sat on the floor, cross-legged like she used to when reading to her elementary students, and started looking for patterns. "Harold, every time Cornelius mentions the chamber, he includes a number. Look, secured 7 more pieces today. And here, the 7 levels of protection are complete. And this one, 7 keys for 7 locks, known only to 7 symbols." 7, Harold repeated. "What does that mean?" "I think," Dorothy said slowly, "it's a clue. 7 keys, 7 locks, 7 symbols." Harold paced the room, thinking like the factory worker he'd been for nearly 4 decades. Problems had solutions. You just had to break them down into steps. "Okay," he said. "We need to find keys, and we need to find symbols that tell us where the keys go." They started in the basement workshop, the only place that felt like somewhere Cornelius had actually worked. Harold searched methodically, opening drawers, checking toolboxes, examining every surface. In the 3rd drawer of the main workbench, tucked beneath a tray of screwdrivers, he found a small wooden box. It wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a brass key. Attached to it by a piece of old string was a tag with one word: truth. "Dorothy," he called up the stairs. She came running, journals clutched to her chest. When she saw the key, her eyes went wide. "That's one," she said. They returned to the library where Harold remembered seeing that brass plate in the conservatory. They found the symbol again, those overlapping circles, and examined it more closely. "It's not just decorative," Harold said, running his fingers along the edges. "It's a button, or a trigger." He pressed it firmly. Nothing happened. He tried twisting it. Still nothing. Dorothy knelt beside him, studying the symbol. Then she noticed something. The circles weren't perfectly overlapping. One was slightly offset. She pressed it in that direction. A soft click echoed through the conservatory. They both froze. Harold stood slowly and walked to the nearest wall. A section of decorative molding had popped out slightly, revealing a seam. He pulled it gently, and a small panel swung open.
Inside was a shallow compartment containing a leather folder. Dorothy opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Cornelius standing beside people in formal wear at what looked like gallery openings and private events. Cornelius shaking hands with men in expensive suits. Cornelius examining paintings, sculptures, ancient-looking artifacts. But what made Harold's breath catch was the photograph on top. Cornelius, maybe 20 years younger, standing in front of a massive painting. The painting showed a woman in Renaissance-era dress, her expression serene, her hands folded delicately. "I know that painting," Dorothy whispered. "Harold, I know it. We studied it in a class I took years ago. It's a Vermeer, The Woman in Yellow. It was stolen from a museum in Amsterdam in 1991. They never found it." They looked at each other. "Surely not," Harold said. Surely he didn't. Dorothy kept digging through the folder. She found receipts from storage facilities across 3 states, bills from climate control companies, invoices from art restoration specialists, and then, at the bottom, a hand-drawn map. It was crude but careful. It showed the layout of the mansion with certain areas marked by symbols, the overlapping circles they'd found in the conservatory, a triangle with a dot in the center, a spiral, a star, others they didn't recognize. "This is it," Dorothy said, her voice shaking. "This is the map to finding the chamber." Over the next week, they became obsessed. Dorothy spent every waking hour reading the journals, making connections, identifying patterns. Harold methodically searched the house, looking for more symbols, more keys, more clues. They found the second key hidden in a false bottom of a desk drawer in Cornelius's bedroom. The tag read, "Beauty." The third key was inside a hollowed-out book in the library, tagged with the word history. Each key was different, different sizes, different weights, different styles, clearly meant for different locks. But Harold and Dorothy were changing too. The practical concerns that had consumed their lives, the medical bills, the tight budget, the worry about making rent, all of it faded into the background. They barely thought about their apartment back in Greenfield. Rebecca called every day, increasingly worried about them, insisting they come home, but they kept putting her off. "Just a few more days," Dorothy would say. "We're almost done sorting through things." But they weren't sorting. They were hunting. Vincent watched them with growing unease. One evening, he found them in the conservatory at 2 a.m, Dorothy on her hands and knees, examining floor tiles, while Harold tapped walls, listening for hollow sounds. "You should stop," Vincent said quietly. Dorothy looked up, exhausted but determined. "We can't. Mr. Cornelius kept these secrets for a reason. He was protecting something, yes, but also protecting you. The people who came here before, they were not collectors. They were criminals, dangerous men who believed Cornelius had things worth killing for." "Killing?" Harold's voice was sharp. Vincent nodded slowly. "Mr. Cornelius never reported the threats to police because he knew what would happen if authorities got involved. They would search the house. They would find whatever he'd hidden, and then everyone would want it." "What is it?" Dorothy demanded. "What did he hide that's worth all this?" "I don't know," Vincent said. "I swear to you, I don't know, but I know it scared him. And I know he said once that some things are too important to belong to any one person or institution. He said they needed to wait until the world was ready." After Vincent left, Harold and Dorothy sat in the dark conservatory, the weight of his words settling over them. "Maybe we should stop," Harold said finally. "Maybe Vincent's right. Maybe some secrets should stay buried." Dorothy was quiet for a long time. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out over the dark grounds. 52 years, she said softly. 52 years we've been together. We've lived small, Harold, safe. We never took risks, never did anything remarkable. We worked, paid our bills, raised our daughter, and stayed invisible." She turned to face him. "Cornelius chose you, not some museum curator or wealthy collector. You. Maybe because he knew you'd actually care about more than the money. Maybe because he knew you'd try to do the right thing. Harold stood and joined her at the window. And what is the right thing? I don't know yet, Dorothy admitted, but I think we need to find out what he was protecting before we can decide. The breakthrough came 3 days later. Dorothy was reading through the second journal, the older one, when she noticed something. Cornelius hadn't just written in English. Scattered throughout were phrases in Latin. She'd taken 2 years of Latin in college, a lifetime ago. Most of it was forgotten, but she could still puzzle out simple phrases. One passage, written in 1967, caught her attention. Septem claves ad septem portas. Veritas in septem symbolis celata. She grabbed a piece of paper and slowly translated. 7 keys to 7 doors, truth hidden in 7 symbols. But it was the next line that made her heart race. Prima clavis in ligno laboris. Secunda in domicilio cognitionis. Tertia in templo viridis. First key in wood of labor, second in home of knowledge, third in temple of green. "Harold!" she shouted. He came running from wherever he'd been searching. She showed him the translation. Wood of labor, Harold said slowly. The workshop. We found the first key there. Home of knowledge, Dorothy continued. The library. We found a key there too. Temple of green, Harold whispered. The conservatory. They hadn't found a key in the conservatory yet. They raced downstairs and began searching with new urgency. Dorothy checked every plant pot. Harold examined the furniture, the window frames, the decorative ironwork. It was Harold who finally found it. Behind a loose stone in the fountain that sat at the center of the room, there was a small waterproof box. Inside was the 4th key, tagged with the word preservation, and beneath the key was a folded piece of paper. Harold opened it carefully. It was written in Cornelius's handwriting, but the ink was faded, the paper yellowed with age. If you've found this, then you've proven yourself worthy of the truth. The chamber lies beneath your feet, 23 feet below the foundation. Access is through the library, east wall, 3rd bookcase from the window. The mechanism requires all 7 keys in the correct sequence. But know this before you continue. What I've protected is not mine to give. It belongs to history, to humanity, to the future. Once you open that chamber, the world will know, and you will bear the responsibility of deciding what happens next. Choose wisely. The 7 keys must be inserted in this order: truth, beauty, history, preservation, memory, wisdom, legacy. The 7 symbols mark the 7 locks. Find them all before attempting entry, or the chamber will seal itself permanently. Cornelius James Mitchell. Dorothy and Harold stood in the conservatory, the note trembling in Harold's hands. 23 feet below us, Dorothy whispered. All this time. We need to find the other 3 keys, Harold said. Memory, wisdom, and legacy. But finding those keys proved harder. They searched for 2 more days, increasingly frustrated. They examined every room, every piece of furniture, every decorative element. Nothing. Then strange things started happening. On a Tuesday morning, Dorothy noticed a car parked at the end of the driveway, just visible through the front gates. It sat there for 3 hours before driving away. The next day, Harold found fresh tire tracks in a part of the grounds Vincent said were never used. On Thursday evening, they heard a noise outside. Harold called Vincent, who came with a flashlight. They found someone had tried to force open a basement window. The lock was damaged, but had held. Harold called the police. 2 officers came, took a report, checked the property. They found evidence that whoever tried to break in had spent significant time examining different entry points, like they were planning a more serious attempt. "You folks have something valuable here?" one officer asked. "Just an old house," Harold said. But he and Dorothy both knew that wasn't true anymore. That night, they made a decision. They would find the remaining keys. They would open the chamber,
and whatever was inside, they would deal with it. Because hiding wasn't working. Cornelius had spent his life running from the truth, and it had caught up with him anyway. Harold and Dorothy weren't going to make the same mistake. The fifth key, tagged memory, was found inside a music box in one of the unused bedrooms on the 3rd floor. Dorothy discovered it while doing a final sweep of areas they'd dismissed as unimportant. The sixth key, tagged wisdom, was hidden in the base of a statue in the formal living room. Harold found it after Dorothy noticed the statue sat slightly crooked on its pedestal. When he lifted it, there was a hollow space underneath. The seventh key, legacy, took 3 more days to find. It was the smallest of all the keys, tucked inside a locket that hung on a portrait of a woman they'd never identified. The portrait hung in the main hallway, one they'd passed 100 times. When Dorothy finally found it, she sat on the floor beneath the portrait and cried, not from relief, but from the weight of what was about to happen. They stood in the library that night, all 7 keys laid out on the desk in order. Truth, beauty, history, preservation, memory, wisdom, legacy. "Are we really doing this?" Harold asked. Dorothy took his hand. "Yes, we are." They walked to the east wall, to the 3rd bookcase from the window. Harold began examining it while Dorothy held the flashlight. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just books and wood and normal construction. Then he noticed the books themselves. 7 books, spaced evenly on the middle shelf, had brass plates on their spines instead of paper labels. And on each brass plate was a symbol, overlapping circles, triangle with a dot, spiral, star, 3 wavy lines, a crescent moon, a perfect square. "The 7 symbols," Dorothy breathed. Harold pulled the first book. It didn't come out. Instead, it tilted forward like a lever. Behind where the book had been was a small keyhole with the overlapping circle symbol engraved above it. He took the first key, truth, and inserted it. It turned smoothly. Something deep in the wall clicked. One by one, they inserted all 7 keys in order, each one turning, each one triggering another mechanical sound deep within the house. When the 7th key turned, the entire bookcase shuddered. Then, with a deep grinding sound of gears that hadn't moved in years, it began to swing inward, revealing a dark opening and a staircase leading down into darkness. Harold and Dorothy stood at the threshold, flashlight beam cutting through the black, their hearts pounding so hard they could feel it in their throats. Somewhere below them, in a chamber no one had entered in years, waited the truth Cornelius had spent his entire life protecting. They took a deep breath, held hands, and stepped into the darkness together. The stone steps descended at a steep angle, each one worn smooth in the center, as if someone had walked them countless times over decades. Harold went first, one hand on the cold wall for balance, the other holding the flashlight. Dorothy followed close behind, her hand gripping the back of his shirt like she used to hold their daughter's hand crossing busy streets. The air grew cooler with each step. Not damp or musty like you'd expect in an underground space, but dry, almost sterile. Harold counted 23 steps before they reached the bottom and stood facing another door, this one steel and modern, completely at odds with the old mansion above. A keypad glowed softly beside it, numbers 0 through 9 illuminated in pale blue. "There's no code in the journals," Dorothy said, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. Harold studied the keypad, thinking. Then he remembered something from the note Cornelius had left. He'd been so focused on the keys and symbols that he'd missed the obvious. Cornelius had been specific about everything being in 7s. "Try 7777, he said. Dorothy pressed the numbers. Nothing happened. Harold thought harder. The year, try 1960. That's when the journals said he started. Dorothy entered 1960. Still nothing. "Wait," she said. "He didn't start the chamber in 1960.
He started acquiring pieces then. The chamber wasn't built until later. She flipped back through the journal she'd brought with her. Here, 1972. That's when he got the permits. Harold nodded. Try 1972. Dorothy entered the numbers. A soft beep sounded, and the steel door clicked open, releasing a quiet hiss of pressurized air. Harold pulled the handle, and the door swung toward them on hydraulic hinges. As soon as the opening was wide enough, motion-activated lights flickered to life inside, bright and white, revealing what lay beyond. They stood frozen in the doorway. The chamber was enormous, at least 50 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a ceiling that stretched up 12 feet or more. The walls were concrete, painted white and spotlessly clean. But it was what filled the chamber that stole their breath and held it hostage. Display cases, dozens of them, glass-fronted climate-controlled cases arranged in precise rows like a museum gallery. And inside those cases were things that should not exist, could not exist, should have been lost to history or locked away in the world's most prestigious museums. Harold took a step forward, then another, his legs moving without conscious thought. Dorothy followed, her hand now gripping his arm so tightly it hurt. The first case they reached held a painting. Even Harold, who knew nothing about art, recognized the style. Thick brushstrokes, vibrant yellows and blues swirling together, a night sky over a small village. The plaque beneath it read, "The Starry Night over the Rhone, Vincent van Gogh, 1888, recovered Amsterdam, 1991. "That's impossible," Dorothy whispered. "The Starry Night over the Rhone is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. I saw it there when I was 23. But Harold was already moving to the next case. This one held a smaller painting, a portrait of a young woman with an enigmatic smile, dressed in Renaissance clothing. The plaque read, "Portrait of a Lady, Rembrandt van Rijn, 1634, recovered Berlin, 1997, believed destroyed in fire." They moved down the row like people in a trance. Each case revealed something more impossible than the last. A Monet water lilies that museums claimed had been destroyed in World War II. A Caravaggio that had been stolen from a church in Italy in 1984 and never recovered. A Botticelli small panel painting that had vanished from a private collection in Switzerland in 1969. But it wasn't just paintings. Another section held sculptures. Ancient Greek and Roman pieces in marble and bronze, some dating back 2,000 years. A small Egyptian sphinx no larger than a house cat carved from black granite. A jade dragon from the Ming dynasty, each one labeled, dated, and documented with acquisition information. Dorothy stopped at a case containing manuscripts. Illuminated medieval texts with gold leaf and brilliant colors still vibrant after centuries. A Shakespeare First Folio. What appeared to be pages from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. She pressed her hand to the glass, tears streaming down her face. "Harold," she managed, "these things are priceless. They're pieces of human history. They shouldn't be here. They should be in museums, universities, places where people can see them." Harold had moved to another section where jewelry was displayed. Not the kind you'd see in a regular jewelry store, but the kind that belonged to royalty. A diamond tiara that looked like it could crown a queen. Emerald necklaces the size of robin's eggs. Gold bracelets encrusted with rubies. Each piece had documentation listing its origin, often including the royal family it had belonged to. One case held nothing but coins. Ancient Roman denarii, Greek drachmas, Byzantine solidi. Chinese cash coins from dynasties Harold had never heard of. Thousands of them, organized by era and region. In the center of the chamber stood a large desk, and on that desk sat a leather-bound ledger similar to the journals they'd found upstairs. Beside it was a modern laptop computer, though the screen was dark and several file boxes neatly labeled with dates. Harold opened the ledger with shaking hands. Cornelius's handwriting filled every page in tiny, precise script. It was an inventory,
each item numbered and described in detail. Painting title, artist, estimated date of creation, provenance, how and when Cornelius had acquired it, condition notes, conservation work performed. Harold flipped to the last page where a final entry had been made. The date was August 13th, one day before Cornelius had died. Collection complete. 347 items catalogued and preserved. Estimated total value, $260 million. Authentication documentation filed in boxes 1 through 7. Provenance research in boxes 8 through 12. Legal documentation in box 13. Awaiting rightful steward, Cornelius James Mitchell. $260 million. Harold had to sit down. His knees gave out and he dropped into the chair behind the desk, the number echoing in his mind like a shout in an empty room. $260 million. Dorothy had found something else. On a small table near the far wall was another envelope, this one marked clearly. To my heirs, to be opened upon discovery of the chamber. Her hands trembled so badly that Harold had to stand and help her open it. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in Cornelius's careful hand. Harold read it aloud, his voice breaking more than once. To whoever finds this, I suspect you have many questions. I will do my best to answer them, though I fear my explanations will only lead to more questions. My name is Cornelius James Mitchell, and everything you see in this chamber represents my life's work. But I am not a thief. I need you to understand that, above all else, I am a protector, a guardian, a steward of things too precious to be lost to greed, politics, or the simple passage of time. My story begins in 1943. I was 21 years old, serving as a translator for the Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War. I spoke 4 languages fluently and could get by in 3 others. This skill put me in contact with the resistance movements in France, Italy, and the Netherlands. I saw firsthand what the Nazis were doing, not just to people, but to culture itself. They were looting museums, private collections, churches, anywhere beautiful or historically significant things could be found. They claimed to be preserving art for a 1,000-year Reich. In reality, they were stealing the world's heritage. I worked with a small group of resistance fighters whose mission was to intercept these stolen goods before they could be transported to Germany. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes we failed. But by the end of the war, our group had hidden away nearly 200 pieces, everything from paintings to sculptures to ancient manuscripts. We planned to return them to their rightful owners once the fighting stopped. But then we discovered something terrible. Many of the pieces we'd saved had belonged to Jewish families who'd been murdered in the camps. Their homes had been destroyed. Their descendants, if any existed, were scattered across the globe with no way to prove ownership. Museums claimed pieces that had been private property. Governments argued over who had legal right to what. It became clear that if we turned everything over to official channels, most of it would disappear into bureaucratic nightmares or end up enriching people who had no right to these treasures. So we made a decision. 5 of us, 5 young people who'd seen too much death and too much destruction, decided to keep the pieces safe until the world was ready to handle them properly. We swore an oath to never profit from them, to preserve and protect them, and to wait for the right time to reveal what we'd done. Over the years, the others died or disappeared. By 1960, I was the last one left, the last guardian of a secret that weighed heavier each year. I could have come forward then. But I'd seen what happened when valuable art surfaced. Lawyers descended like vultures. Legitimate heirs were drowned out by fraudsters. Pieces ended up in private collections when no one would ever see them again. So I continued. I became a private acquisition specialist, working for wealthy clients to locate and purchase rare items. It gave me cover to investigate pieces that came up for sale, to verify their provenance, to identify items that had been stolen or inappropriately sold.
When I found such pieces, I would acquire them through legal channels, pay fair market value, and then quietly add them to my collection. Not to own them, you understand, but to protect them until they could be properly returned to public trust. I've spent millions of my own money on this work. I've lived modestly in this large house because every dollar I saved went toward acquiring and preserving these pieces. I've maintained perfect climate control, hired the best conservators who worked under strict confidentiality agreements, and documented everything meticulously so that when the time came, the truth could be known. The time has come. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and this responsibility now falls to you. I chose my heir carefully, though from a distance. Harold Mitchell, if you're reading this, know that I watched you for years. I saw a man who worked honestly all his life, who raised a good family, who never took shortcuts or compromised his integrity. You remind me of my father, and that's why I chose you. What you do with this collection is now your choice. You have several options. 1. You can work with museums and governments to return pieces to their countries of origin or to descendants of original owners where they can be identified. 2. You can donate everything to public institutions where they'll be displayed for the world to see. 3. You can sell it all and take the money, though I pray you won't. Or 4. You can continue my work, maintaining and protecting these pieces until you feel the world is truly ready. I've prepared documentation for each piece showing exactly where it came from, how I acquired it, and who might have legitimate claim to it. I've also assembled a network of trusted contacts, museum directors, art historians, authentication experts, lawyers who specialize in art repatriation. Their names and contact information are in the files. They've been waiting for word from whoever inherited my estate. This will not be easy. Once you reveal this collection, your life will change dramatically. There will be media attention, legal battles, people questioning your motives and my methods. There will be those who claim these pieces belong to them. There will be governments demanding everything be turned over to their custody. You'll need strength, wisdom, and the ability to withstand pressure from all sides. But I believe you can handle it. I believe I've chosen well. And I believe that what's in this chamber represents hope. Hope that beautiful things can survive the worst humanity has to offer. Hope that there are still people willing to do the right thing even when it's hard. Hope that art and history and culture matter enough to fight for. Do what your conscience tells you is right. Trust your instincts, and know that whatever you decide, I'm grateful. You've freed me from a burden I've carried alone for too long. Cornelius James Mitchell, August 13, 2024. Harold finished reading and carefully folded the letter, his hands still shaking. He and Dorothy sat in silence for a long time, surrounded by centuries of human achievement, the weight of Cornelius's confession settling over them like snow. "He wasn't a criminal," Dorothy finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was trying to save things." "From a war that ended 80 years ago," Harold added. "And he never stopped. He kept saving things, kept protecting them, for his entire adult life." Dorothy stood and walked to one of the display cases, looking at a small painting of a mother and child. The plaque said it had been stolen from a synagogue in Poland in 1943. "Someone's family lost this," she said quietly. "Someone's grandmother or great-grandmother prayed in front of this painting, and then the Nazis took it, and everyone who knew where it belonged died in the camps." Harold joined her, looking at the painting. "Cornelius saved it, kept it safe for 81 years, and now he's asking us to finish what he started." "Can we?" Dorothy asked. "Harold, we're just two old people who can barely manage our own medical bills. How are we supposed to handle something this enormous?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He walked around the chamber, looking at case after case, each one holding something irreplaceable. He thought about his life, all those years on the assembly line, doing the same task over and over, never questioning, never dreaming of anything bigger. He thought about their small apartment, their careful budget, their quiet existence, and he thought about what Cornelius had written. I saw a man who worked honestly all his life, who never took shortcuts or compromised his integrity.
Maybe that's exactly why we can handle it, Harold said finally. Because we're not collectors or dealers or people who see dollar signs when we look at art. We're just people who know the difference between right and wrong. Dorothy turned to face him, tears still wet on her cheeks. What are you saying?
I'm saying Cornelius was right to hide all this. The world wasn't ready. Maybe it still isn't. But we can't keep hiding it forever. These things belong to people, to history, to everyone.
So we give it all away? Dorothy asked. All $260 million worth? Harold nodded slowly. We give it back. Not to governments or institutions or whoever can afford the best lawyers. We give it back to the people it was stolen from. And the pieces that have no one left to claim them? Those go to museums where everyone can see them. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then a small smile broke through her tears. You know what this means, don't you? We'll never be rich. We'll still be two old people living on Social Security and whatever pittance we can scrape together.
I know. Rebecca's going to think we've lost our minds.
Probably. The media will have a field day. They'll dig into every part of our lives. People will question everything we do.
I know. Dorothy stepped closer and took his hands. 52 years we've been married. I thought I knew everything about you, but I'm just now realizing that you're the kind of man who'd inherit $260 million and give it all away because it's the right thing to do.
Harold squeezed her hands. We both are. That's why we work. They kissed then, there in the underground chamber surrounded by treasures beyond imagining, two ordinary people who'd just made an extraordinary choice. When they finally climbed back up the stairs and emerged into the library, they found Vincent waiting. He stood near the bookcase that had swung open, his weathered face unreadable.
You found it, he said.
Not a question.
You knew,
Dorothy replied. Also not a question. Vincent nodded slowly. I've known since 1986. Mr. Cornelius needed help installing some of the climate control systems. He couldn't have workers coming in without someone he trusted overseeing them. So he told me, swore me to secrecy, and allowed me to see what he'd been protecting. You never said anything, Harold said. It wasn't my secret to tell. Mr. Cornelius made me promise I would only speak of it if his heirs found it on their own. He said that would prove they were worthy. Vincent's eyes were bright with unshed tears. And you are. You found it, you understand it, and unless I'm very wrong, you've already decided what to do with it.
We're giving it back, Dorothy said. All of it.
Vincent's face broke into the first real smile they'd seen from him. I knew you would. Mr. Cornelius said his nephew would know the right thing to do. He walked to the desk and pulled out a drawer, removing a thick folder. Then you'll need these. Contact information for everyone Mr. Cornelius worked with over the years. Authentication experts, museum directors, lawyers who specialize in art repatriation, researchers who've been tracking stolen art for decades. They've all been waiting, some of them for 30 years or more, to hear from whoever inherited this collection. Harold took the folder, feeling its weight. How do we even start? With one piece at a time, Vincent said. That's how Mr. Cornelius built it, one piece at a time, and that's how you'll return it. But you won't be alone. There are people all over the world who've dedicated their lives to reuniting stolen art with its rightful owners. They'll help you. Over the next several hours, they sat in the library while Vincent told them stories. About the pieces Cornelius had tracked down, about families he'd contacted anonymously over the years, asking questions about their heritage without revealing why, about the meticulous research he'd done to document every item. There's a woman in Tel Aviv, Vincent said, whose grandmother's wedding portrait is in one of those cases. Mr. Cornelius found out about her 3 years ago,
but he was too ill to travel by then. He made me promise that when the time came, she would be the first person contacted. Dorothy pulled out her notebook, the same one she'd been using to track clues through the journals. Now she was taking notes for a different purpose. What's her name? Sarah Goldstein. She's 78 years old. Her grandmother died in Auschwitz. The portrait was painted in 1936. It's the only image Sarah has ever seen of her grandmother as a young woman. Dorothy wrote it down carefully. She'll be the first one we call. They worked through the night, Vincent sharing everything he knew, Harold and Dorothy taking notes, asking questions, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd inherited. Not just objects, but stories. Not just value, but meaning. As dawn broke and golden light began streaming through the library windows, Harold stood and stretched his aching back. He walked to the window and looked out over the mansion grounds. Somewhere out there, beyond the manicured lawns and ancient trees, was a world that had no idea what was about to be revealed. He thought about their daughter, Rebecca, who'd wanted them to sell everything and move to Seattle. He'd have to call her soon, explain what they'd found, help her understand why they couldn't just walk away with the money. He thought about their small apartment back in Greenfield, sitting empty now, their few possessions still arranged exactly as they'd left them. That life seemed impossibly far away, like it had belonged to different people. He thought about Cornelius, a man he'd barely known, who'd watched him from a distance and decided Harold was worthy of this burden. He wondered what Cornelius had seen in him that he'd never seen in himself. Dorothy appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," Harold admitted. "Me too." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "But also excited, also hopeful. We're 73 and 71 years old, and for the first time in decades, I feel like we're actually living instead of just surviving." Harold put his arm around her. "We're going to make mistakes. We're going to get things wrong. People are going to criticize us and question our choices." "Probably," Dorothy agreed, "but we're going to try. We're going to do our best to honor what Cornelius spent his life protecting. And maybe, just maybe, we'll help some people find pieces of their history they thought were lost forever." Vincent joined them at the window, standing slightly behind, giving them their moment. "Mr. Cornelius used to stand right here," he said quietly, "watching the sun rise, carrying all those secrets alone. I think he'd be very glad to know he's not alone anymore, that the burden has been shared with people who understand what it means." Harold turned to face the old caretaker. "Help us, Vincent. Don't just watch from the sidelines. Cornelius trusted you for 43 years. We're going to need someone who knew him, who understands what he was trying to do." Vincent's eyes welled with tears. He'd been the loyal servant for so long, asking nothing, expecting nothing. Now he was being invited to be part of something bigger. "It would be my honor," he said, his voice breaking. They stood together in the morning light, three people who 24 hours ago had been strangers to this shared purpose, now bound together by a secret that would soon belong to the world. Below them, 23 feet underground, $260 million worth of history waited patiently in climate-controlled silence. But Harold and Dorothy weren't thinking about the money anymore. They were thinking about Sarah Goldstein in Tel Aviv, waiting to see her grandmother's face. They were thinking about all the other families who'd lost pieces of themselves to war and hatred and time. And they were thinking about how two ordinary people with grease under their nails and library cards in their wallets were about to do something extraordinary. Not because they had to, but because Cornelius had believed they would. And sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to help you become who you were always meant to be. The first call was the hardest. Harold sat at Cornelius's desk in the library, staring at the phone number Vincent had written down for Sarah Goldstein. His hand hovered over the telephone receiver for a full minute before Dorothy reached over and placed her hand on top of his. "You can do this," she said softly. "This is why we found it all." Harold nodded, picked up the receiver, and dialed the international number. It rang 4 times before a woman answered in Hebrew. Harold didn't understand the words, but he recognized the questioning tone. "Hello, do you speak English?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Yes, I speak English," the woman replied, her accent thick but her words clear. "Who is calling?" "My name is Harold Mitchell. I'm calling from the United States. I'm trying to reach Sarah Goldstein." "I am Sarah Goldstein." Suspicion crept into her voice. "Is this about money? Because I don't give to telephone solicitations." No, nothing like that," Harold said quickly. He looked at Dorothy, who nodded encouragement. "Mrs. Goldstein, this is going to sound strange, but I recently inherited an estate from my uncle, and while going through his possessions, we found something that I believe belongs to your family." Silence on the other end. "Mrs. Goldstein? What kind of something?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. Harold took a deep breath. "A portrait, painted in 1936, of a young woman on her wedding day." He heard a sharp intake of breath, then nothing. For a moment, Harold thought she'd hung up. Then he heard crying, soft at first, then harder. "How?" Sarah finally managed. "How do you have this? The Nazis took everything. My grandmother, my grandfather, their entire family. Everything was destroyed." "My uncle spent his life recovering stolen art," Harold explained gently. "He tracked down pieces that were taken during the war. He's been keeping them safe, waiting for the right time to return them." "Return them?" Sarah repeated. "You mean you're giving it back? You're not trying to sell it to me?" "We're giving it back," Harold confirmed. "It belongs to you. It always belonged to you." What followed was 20 minutes of tears, questions, and a story Harold would never forget. Sarah told him about growing up knowing almost nothing about her family, how they'd all died before she was born, how she'd spent her entire life feeling disconnected from her own history because there was nothing left, no photos, no heirlooms, no tangible proof that her grandmother had even existed beyond documents and strangers' testimony. "I've only seen one photograph of her," Sarah said, her voice raw. "A grainy copy someone found in an archive. I've stared at it my whole life, trying to see myself in her face. And now you're telling me there's a painted portrait, where she's young and happy and getting married?" "Yes," Harold said. "And Mrs. Goldstein, it's beautiful. She's beautiful, and she looks exactly like you." Sarah cried again. So did Dorothy, who'd been listening on the extension. So did Vincent, standing in the doorway. They spent another hour on the phone, Harold explaining how they'd found the collection, what else was down there, what they planned to do with all of it. Sarah told them about the organization she worked with in Israel that helped families recover stolen art and artifacts. She gave him names, contact information, promised to help in any way she could. "When can I see it?" she finally asked. "The portrait." "We need to arrange proper authentication and documentation first," Harold said, looking at Vincent, who was nodding. "But soon. Maybe a month or 2. "I've waited 78 years, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "I can wait a little longer." After they hung up, Harold sat back in the chair and rubbed his face with both hands. Dorothy came around the desk and hugged him from behind. "One down," she whispered. 346 to go. But word spread faster than they expected. Sarah Goldstein called the organization she'd mentioned, and they called other organizations. Within 3 days, Harold and Dorothy's phone was ringing constantly. Museum directors, art historians, lawyers specializing in Holocaust restitution, journalists who'd somehow caught wind of the story. On the 4th day, a reporter from the Washington Post showed up at the mansion gates. Vincent turned them away, but the next morning 2 more journalists arrived, then 5, then a news van. Marcus Brennan, the attorney, called in a panic. Harold, what's happening? I'm getting calls from media outlets asking about the Mitchell estate. What should I tell them? Harold and Dorothy made a decision. They couldn't hide anymore. Cornelius had hidden the collection for 80 years. It was time to bring it into the light. They called a press conference for the following week, giving themselves time to prepare. Vincent helped them organize. They contacted the most credible journalists, the ones known for serious reporting rather than sensationalism. They prepared a statement. They had authentication experts examine and verify several pieces to prove they weren't lying or deluded. The night before the press conference, Harold couldn't sleep. He stood at the bedroom window, looking out over the dark grounds, wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. Dorothy found him there at 3 a.m. "Second thoughts?" she asked. "Third and fourth thoughts," Harold admitted. "What if we're wrong? What if bringing all this to light causes more harm than good?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Cornelius had the same fears. That's why he hid everything for so long. But Harold, he also knew that hiding truth forever isn't protecting it. It's just another way of losing it. The press conference was held in the mansion's formal dining room. They'd set up chairs for 30 journalists, but nearly 60 showed up. Cameras lined the back wall. Microphones crowded the podium Vincent had borrowed from the local community center. Harold stood at the podium in his only suit, bought 17 years ago for their grandson's baptism. Dorothy sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite her arthritis. Harold's hands shook as he held the prepared statement, but his voice was steady. "My name is Harold Mitchell. I'm 73 years old. Until a month ago, I was a retired factory worker living on Social Security in Greenfield, Pennsylvania. Then I inherited a mansion from an uncle I barely knew, and in that mansion, we found something that's going to be hard for you to believe." He told the story methodically, showing documents, authentication certificates, photographs of some of the collection pieces. He explained Cornelius's history, his service in World War II, his decades of quietly recovering stolen art. He read portions of Cornelius's letter explaining his methods and motivations. Then he got to the part that made the room go completely silent. The collection contains 347 pieces, paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, artifacts, jewelry, conservatively valued at $260 million. And my wife and I have decided to return all of it, not sell it, return it, to the families it was stolen from, to the museums and institutions where it belongs, to the world that lost these pieces to war and greed. The room erupted. Journalists shouting questions, cameras flashing, everyone talking at once. Harold stood calmly at the podium, waiting for the chaos to settle. "We'll take questions now," he said. "Mr. Mitchell, are you seriously saying you're giving away $250 million? "Yes." "Why? Why wouldn't you keep it or at least sell it and donate the money to charity?" Harold glanced at Dorothy, who nodded. "Because these pieces aren't ours to sell. They were stolen from families, many of whom died in the Holocaust or other tragedies. Returning them isn't generosity. It's justice." "What about the pieces that have no living heirs? What happens to those?" "They'll be donated to public museums and institutions where everyone can see them. Art this important shouldn't be locked away in private collections." "Mr. Mitchell, you realize you could be wealthy beyond measure. You could live in luxury for the rest of your life, and you're just walking away from that." Harold smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "My wife and I have been wealthy in the ways that matter for 52 years. We have a daughter we love, grandchildren who make us laugh, and 52 years of memories built on trust and honest work. $260 million wouldn't make us happier, but helping people recover pieces of their history, that might." The story hit every major news outlet within hours. By evening, it was the lead story on national television. By the next morning, it was international news. Elderly couple discovers hidden art collection worth millions, decides to give it all away. The headlines varied, but the story was the same, and the world couldn't get enough of it. Harold and Dorothy's phone rang off the hook. Interview requests from every major network, calls from museums begging to be first to receive pieces, lawyers offering to help with the repatriation process, and most importantly, families reaching out with stories of lost heirlooms, stolen treasures, pieces of history they thought they'd never see again. Dorothy set up a system. She'd been a librarian for 42 years, and organization was in her blood. She created files for each piece in the collection, cross-referenced with possible claimants, documented every phone call and email, tracked authentication progress, and maintained detailed records of every step they took. Harold worked with Vincent and a team of art experts they'd assembled to carefully document and prepare each piece for eventual return. They photographed everything from multiple angles, had conservation experts assess condition, worked with authentication specialists to verify provenance. Their daughter Rebecca flew in from Seattle 3 days after the press conference. She walked into the mansion with her husband David, took one look at her parents surrounded by files and ringing phones and experts examining paintings, and burst into tears. "Mom, Dad, what have you gotten yourselves into?" she asked, hugging them both. "Something bigger than we expected," Dorothy admitted, "but something right." Rebecca had thought they were crazy when Harold first told her about the collection over the phone. She'd been certain they were being scammed or had misunderstood something, but seeing it all in person, seeing the careful documentation, the authentication certificates, the sheer overwhelming magnitude of what they'd found, she understood. "You're really giving it all away," she said, not quite a question. "Every piece," Harold confirmed. Rebecca looked at her parents, these two people who'd raised her on a tight budget, who'd worked so hard just to get by, who were now surrounded by more wealth than she could comprehend and choosing to give it up. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "So incredibly proud." But not everyone was supportive. The criticism started almost immediately. A financial advisor went on television calling them foolish. "They could have secured their family's future for generations," he said, shaking his head. "Instead, they're giving away a fortune to strangers." Opinion pieces appeared questioning their mental competence. "Are these elderly people being manipulated?" one article asked. "Should someone this age be making decisions about hundreds of millions of dollars?" Anonymous letters arrived at the mansion, some calling them saints, others calling them idiots. One particularly cruel message read, "You're spitting on every hard-working American who's struggling to make ends meet. You could have helped thousands of people with that money. Instead, you're returning paintings to dead people." Dorothy read that one aloud to Harold one evening. He was quiet for a long time. "Do you think they're right?" she asked. "Could we have done more good by selling everything and giving the money to charity?" Harold thought about it carefully before answering. "Maybe, I don't know. But here's what I do know. Those paintings and sculptures and manuscripts, they're not just valuable objects. They're pieces of people's souls. Sarah Goldstein's grandmother posed for that portrait on the happiest day of her life. Then the Nazis murdered her and stole it. Giving it back to Sarah isn't about money. It's about saying that what was stolen from her family matters, that her grandmother's life mattered, that justice matters even 80 years later." Dorothy nodded slowly. "And the money we could have made from selling it? That would have disappeared in a generation or two. But the stories, the healing, the message that ordinary people can still choose to do right, that might last forever." The first reunification ceremony happened 6 weeks later in Tel Aviv. Harold and Dorothy flew to Israel, their first time on an airplane, first time leaving the country, first time seeing the world beyond their small Pennsylvania town. Sarah Goldstein met them at the museum where the ceremony would be held. She was exactly as Harold had imagined her from their phone conversations. Small, dignified, with eyes that had seen both terrible sorrow and enduring hope. When she saw them, she walked straight to Harold and hugged him like he was family. "You're real," she kept saying. "I was afraid I'd dreamed the whole thing." "We're real," Harold assured her, "and so is your grandmother's portrait." The ceremony was held in a private room at the museum, attended by Sarah's children and grandchildren, officials from the Israeli government, representatives from Holocaust restitution organizations, and a small group of journalists documenting the moment. The portrait, carefully packed and transported by professional art movers, sat covered on an easel at the front of the room. A museum director spoke about the importance of returning stolen art, about how each piece represented not just monetary value, but human connection, family history, cultural heritage. Then Harold stood, feeling every one of his 73 years, and spoke briefly. "My uncle Cornelius spent his life protecting beautiful things. But this portrait isn't beautiful because of the paint or the frame or the artist's skill. It's beautiful because of what it represents. A young woman on the happiest day of her life, a moment of joy before the darkness came. And it's beautiful because Sarah has waited 78 years to see her grandmother's face." He walked to the easel and carefully removed the covering. The portrait showed a young woman in a white wedding dress, dark hair pinned up with flowers, eyes bright with happiness, hands clasped around a small bouquet. The painting was exquisite, clearly done by a skilled artist, the colors still vibrant after 88 years. Sarah stood slowly, walked toward the portrait like she was in a trance, and stopped 3 feet away, just staring. "I look like her," she whispered. "Everyone always said so, but I could never see it in that grainy photograph. But now—" She turned to look at her own daughter. "Rebecca, you have her eyes." Sarah's daughter, also named for the woman in the portrait, came forward. She looked from her mother to the painting and back again. "Grandma, she looks exactly like you did in your wedding photos." 3 generations of women stood together, looking at the portrait of their ancestor, a woman they'd thought was lost to history forever. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sarah turned to Harold and Dorothy. "How can I ever thank you?" "You already have," Dorothy said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Just by loving her, by remembering her, by making sure her story didn't end in Auschwitz." The ceremony was filmed and photographed. The images went viral within hours. An elderly couple returns priceless portrait to Holocaust survivors' granddaughter. The story touched something deep in people, reminded them that beauty could survive darkness, that justice delayed was still justice, that ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things. More ceremonies followed. A Caravaggio returned to a church in Sicily, stolen by the Mafia in 1984 and recovered by Cornelius 3 years later. The priest wept as it was rehung in its original location, exactly where it had been for 400 years. A medieval manuscript returned to a monastery in Germany, where it had been kept for 7 centuries before disappearing during the chaos of World War II. The monks sang a special mass to celebrate its return. A bronze statue returned to a family in the Netherlands, stolen from their estate in 1943 when the family went into hiding. 3 family members had survived the war. 79 years later, their grandchildren stood together as the statue was unveiled, a bronze dancer their great-grandfather had commissioned from a famous sculptor in 1932. But not every return was straightforward. Some pieces had multiple claimants, families arguing over who had rightful ownership. Harold and Dorothy learned to navigate these disputes carefully, working with lawyers and historians to establish clear chains of ownership, sometimes having to make difficult decisions about conflicting claims. One particularly challenging case involved a set of jade figurines from China. 3 different families claimed them, each with documentation showing their ancestors had owned the pieces before they were looted during various conflicts. Harold spent 2 months researching, consulting with experts, reviewing historical records. In the end, they determined that 2 families had legitimate claims to different pieces in the set, while the third family's documentation had been falsified. The decision to split the collection made one family angry. They threatened to sue. They went on Chinese television claiming Harold and Dorothy were biased against them. It was the first time Harold truly understood what Cornelius had meant about the burden of this responsibility. "Maybe we should have just sold everything," he said to Dorothy one night, exhausted from another day of angry phone calls and legal threats. "Let someone else deal with all this mess." Dorothy took his hand. Cornelius could have done that too. He could have turned everything over to authorities and walked away. But he didn't, because he understood that doing the right thing is rarely easy, and because he knew that someone had to care enough to get it right, even when it was hard. The lawsuit was eventually dropped when independent authentication experts confirmed Harold and Dorothy's research. The family that had falsified documents issued a public apology. But the experience taught them that justice was complicated, that even with the best intentions, they would make decisions that left some people unhappy. Each ceremony was emotional. Each one felt like healing an old wound, stitching together pieces of history that had been violently torn apart. Harold and Dorothy attended as many as they could. They were in their 70s, not wealthy enough to afford constant international travel, but museums and families often offered to pay their way, wanting them there to witness what their choice had made possible. One ceremony in particular changed something fundamental in Harold. It was in a small town in Poland, returning a Torah scroll to a synagogue that had been rebuilt on the site where the original had been destroyed by Nazis in 1941. The scroll had survived because a Christian family had hidden it in their barn for decades, risking their lives to protect it. When Harold handed the scroll to the rabbi, the old man held it like it was made of light itself. He unrolled it slightly, his fingers trembling as he touched the handwritten Hebrew letters. "My grandfather was the rabbi here," he said, his voice breaking. "He died protecting this synagogue. Every Sabbath growing up, I heard stories about the beautiful Torah scroll that had been in our family for 200 years. Stories of my grandfather reading from it, teaching from it, loving it like it was alive." The rabbi looked up at Harold. "I never thought I would touch it. I never thought it still existed. But here it is. And here you are, a Christian man from America who had no obligation to care about a Torah scroll from a Polish synagogue. Yet you cared. You brought it home." Harold couldn't speak. He just embraced the rabbi while the small crowd of survivors and their descendants sang prayers of thanksgiving. That night, lying in their hotel room, Harold said to Dorothy, "I finally understand what Cornelius meant. It's not about the money or even the art. It's about saying that what happened to these people matters, that their losses matter, that someone remembers and someone cares." The pieces that had no living claimants, roughly 130 of them, were donated to museums around the world. A Van Gogh went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a Rembrandt to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, ancient manuscripts to the Library of Congress. Each institution agreed to display them with placards explaining how they'd been recovered and preserved by Cornelius Mitchell and how his heirs had chosen to share them with the world. 8 months after the discovery, Harold and Dorothy established the Cornelius Mitchell Foundation for Art Repatriation. They used the mansion as its headquarters, converting several rooms into offices and research spaces. The Foundation's mission was to help other families track down stolen art and artifacts, to provide resources for authentication and legal support to continue the work Cornelius had started. Vincent became the Foundation's first official employee, Director of Historical Research. His decades of knowledge about Cornelius's methods and contacts proved invaluable. Their daughter Rebecca moved back from Seattle to help run the Foundation. She'd been a non-profit administrator before having kids, and her skills in grant writing and program management were exactly what they needed. The foundation didn't make Harold and Dorothy rich, but it paid them modest salaries, enough to live comfortably. They moved into the mansion permanently, though they chose to live in Cornelius's old room, the simple one, not any of the grand master suites. They ate in the small breakfast nook off the kitchen, not the formal dining room. They still drove their 1998 Ford station wagon until it finally died 2 years later, after which they bought a used Honda Civic. People couldn't understand it. "You could have been millionaires," a journalist said to Harold during an interview on the foundation's 1-year anniversary. "We are millionaires," Harold replied. "We're rich in purpose, rich in knowing we helped people, rich in the stories we've heard and the lives we've touched." He smiled. "Turns out that's worth more than $260 million. The foundation grew. They hired staff, brought in experts, developed protocols for verifying claims and processing returns. Word spread through networks of families searching for lost heritage, museums tracking stolen pieces, governments trying to repatriate cultural treasures. In the first 2 years, they successfully returned or helped return 63 additional pieces beyond Cornelius's original collection, items that families reached out about after hearing the Mitchells' story. Each return felt like a victory, like proof that Cornelius's faith in humanity hadn't been misplaced. Vincent's story became clear during this time too. He'd been a young soldier in Italy, barely 20 years old, when he'd met Cornelius during the war. Cornelius had saved his life during a firefight, pulled him to safety when he'd been wounded and left behind during a retreat. Afterward, Vincent had sworn he'd spend his life repaying that debt. "But you already have," Harold told him one evening as they sat together in the library, the same place Dorothy had first found Cornelius's journal. "You've honored him better than anyone could have." Vincent shook his head. "No, you honored him. You finished what he started. I just kept watch over empty rooms for 40 years. You brought everything into the light." "You kept the faith," Dorothy said gently. "For 43 years you protected his secret, believed in his mission, waited for someone worthy to inherit it. That's not a small thing, Vincent. That's everything." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He'd spent most of his life in service to someone else's dream. Now, in his 80s, he was finally part of something that felt complete. Harold and Dorothy changed in ways both subtle and profound. Dorothy's arthritis didn't improve, but she stopped noticing it as much. She was too busy organizing ceremonies, researching provenance, talking to families whose heirlooms were in their care. Her mind was sharp as ever, sharper even, engaged in work that mattered. Harold's heart medication was still expensive, but now they could afford it without panic. More importantly, Harold's heart itself seemed stronger. The tightness around his eyes was gone. The worry that had creased his forehead for decades had smoothed away. He slept better, smiled more, walked with straighter posture. Their doctor noticed during a routine checkup 18 months after they'd moved into the mansion. "Whatever you two are doing," she said, reviewing their charts, "keep doing it. Your blood pressure is better. Your stress markers are down. You both seem 10 years younger than your last visit." "We found something worth waking up for," Dorothy said simply. "You know what's funny?" Dorothy said one night as they got ready for bed in Cornelius's old room. "We spent 50 years worrying about money, stretching every dollar, afraid of falling behind. And now we've had access to more money than we ever imagined, and we gave it all away, and somehow we're happier than we've ever been." Harold pulled her close. "Because we finally found what we were supposed to do, not just work to survive, but work for something bigger than ourselves." Their grandchildren visited regularly now, fascinated by what their grandparents had become. The oldest, 15-year-old Jason, started volunteering at the foundation on weekends, learning about art history and provenance research. He told his friends at school that his grandparents were basically superheroes. "They're just regular people who chose to do something irregular," he said during a school presentation about his family. And that's cooler than being born special, because it means anyone can do it. The younger grandchildren, twins Emma and Noah, who were 9 years old, created a game they called Art Detectives, where they pretended to track down stolen treasures and return them to families. Dorothy found them one afternoon in the library, carefully examining a book about Renaissance paintings with a magnifying glass. "We're looking for clues," Emma explained seriously, "like you and Grandpa do." "What kind of clues are you looking for?" Dorothy asked, sitting down beside them. "Clues about where beautiful things belong," Noah said, "so we can take them home." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Even the children understood what they were doing, understood that beauty belonged to everyone, not locked away in private collections or lost to history. The Foundation received thousands of letters, some from families hoping to recover lost items, some from people thanking them for restoring their faith in humanity, some from elderly people who'd lost everything in the war and never thought anyone would care enough to try to make it right. One letter came from a man in Argentina whose mother had escaped Germany in 1938. She'd been forced to leave everything behind, including a small painting her father had done of their family home. The man had heard about the Mitchell Foundation and wondered, though he knew it was unlikely, if perhaps his grandfather's painting had somehow survived. Dorothy spent 3 weeks researching. She contacted museums, checked databases of stolen art, reviewed Cornelius's files. She didn't find the painting itself, but she found something almost as good: photographs of the painting taken by a Jewish documentation project in 1937, before everything was destroyed. She sent the photographs to the man in Argentina, along with a letter explaining what she'd found. His response came 2 weeks later. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell, I've been staring at these photographs for days. I can't stop crying. In the painting, I can see my mother's bedroom window, the tree she told me about climbing as a child, the flowers her mother grew in the garden. I can see the house where my family lived for 3 generations before Hitler destroyed everything. Thank you for giving me this glimpse of what was lost. You didn't find the painting, but you found proof that it existed, that my family's home was real and beautiful and worth remembering. That's more than I ever hoped for." Dorothy kept that letter in her desk drawer and read it whenever she felt discouraged or overwhelmed by the magnitude of their work. Harold and Dorothy learned to handle the media attention that never quite went away. They were invited to speak at universities, conferences, museum openings. Harold, who'd spent his life avoiding the spotlight, learned to stand in front of crowds and tell Cornelius's story, tell their story, inspire others to think differently about wealth and legacy and responsibility. One speech in particular, delivered at a gathering of Holocaust survivors and their descendants in Washington, D.C., became famous. Harold spoke without notes, just from his heart. "My wife and I were nobody special," he said. "We worked hard, raised our daughter, paid our bills. We never expected to be standing here. We never expected to inherit anything, much less something worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But when we found what my uncle had hidden, we had a choice. We could keep it, sell it, secure our family's financial future for generations. Or we could honor what he'd spent his life protecting. We could choose to see these pieces not as assets but as stolen pieces of people's souls that needed to go home." He paused, looking out at the audience of survivors, their children, their grandchildren. "I can't stand here and tell you I understand your loss. I can't pretend to know what it was like to have everything stolen, everyone you loved murdered, your entire world destroyed. But I can tell you this. Cornelius Mitchell saw what the Nazis did. He saw them stealing not just lives but the beautiful things that made those lives meaningful. And he decided to spend his entire life making sure some of that beauty survived. That some of it could go home." Harold's voice broke. "And my wife and I, we're just trying to finish what he started. Because we learned something these past 2 years. Justice isn't about money. It's about remembering. It's about saying that what was taken from you matters, that your grandmother's wedding portrait matters, that your family's Torah scroll matters, that the painting your grandfather made of your home matters, that you matter. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. 2 years after discovering the chamber, Harold stood in the mansion's conservatory where he'd first found the symbol that started everything. The foundation was hosting an open house celebrating their 2nd anniversary and the successful return of 293 of Cornelius's original 347 pieces. Journalists, donors, families who'd received items, museum directors, and government officials filled the rooms. Harold watched them mingle, heard their conversations and laughter, and felt something he hadn't felt since he was young: pride. Not pride in himself exactly, but pride in what he and Dorothy had helped create. This community of people dedicated to justice, to healing, to making sure the past wasn't forgotten. Sarah Goldstein had flown in from Israel for the celebration. She found Harold standing alone in the conservatory and joined him by the fountain. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "My Uncle Cornelius," Harold said, "wondering if he'd be proud of what we've done." Sarah smiled. He knew exactly what would happen. That's why he chose you. "How could he have known? He barely knew me." "He knew enough," Sarah said. "He knew you were the kind of man who'd see $260 million and choose justice over wealth. That's rare, rarer than any painting or sculpture in that collection." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "My grandmother's portrait hangs in my living room now," Sarah said. "Every morning when I wake up I see her face. My great-grandchildren ask about her, and I can tell them stories. They know who they came from. They know they're part of something that survived." She turned to Harold. "You gave me back my history. How do you thank someone for that?" "By living well," Harold said softly, "by remembering, by making sure the story continues." That night, after all the guests had left and the caterers had cleaned up, Harold and Dorothy stood alone in the chamber one final time. It was nearly empty now. Most of the display cases had been removed. The ones that remained held the last 54 pieces, items they were still researching, still trying to find rightful owners for. "Remember the first time we came down here?" Dorothy asked, her voice echoing slightly in the large space. "I thought we were crazy," Harold admitted. "Two old people who could barely afford groceries suddenly responsible for treasure beyond imagining." "And now?" Harold looked around the chamber, at the empty spaces where paintings had hung, where sculptures had stood, where centuries of human achievement had waited patiently for justice. "Now I think we were exactly where we were supposed to be, doing exactly what we were meant to do." They climbed the stairs together, turned off the lights and closed the chamber door. There would be more returns, more ceremonies, more families reunited with their heritage. The work wasn't finished. It might never be finished. But as Harold and Dorothy walked through the mansion that had changed their lives, past the library where Dorothy had first found the journal, through the conservatory where they'd discovered the first clue, up the stairs to Cornelius's simple bedroom where they now slept, they knew they'd made the right choice. They could have been millionaires. They could have sold everything and lived in luxury. Instead, they'd chosen to give it all away, to return stolen beauty to a world that had lost too much, to prove that ordinary people could still do extraordinary things. And in doing so, they'd found something more valuable than $260 million. They'd found purpose, meaning, and a legacy that would outlive them both. Cornelius Mitchell had spent his life protecting beauty. Harold and Dorothy had spent theirs setting it free. And sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you keep, it's what you give away. Anyone can inherit wealth, but only the brave inherit responsibility and choose to honor it. Anyone can find treasure, but only the wise understand that some things are worth more than money. And anyone can live a small life, but Harold and Dorothy proved that it's never too late to live a large one. As the morning sun rose over the Willow Heights mansion for the 1,000th time since they'd arrived, Harold and Dorothy sat together on the front steps, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up. They were still the same people who'd struggled to pay rent, who'd stretched every dollar, who'd lived simply and loved deeply for 52 years. Except now they understood something they'd never quite grasped before. They'd always been rich. They just hadn't known it until they gave away a fortune. Because the measure of a life isn't in bank accounts or possessions or even in the things we accumulate. It's in the moments we choose to do right instead of easy, to give instead of take, to honor instead of exploit. Harold and Dorothy Mitchell didn't inherit a mansion. They inherited a mission, and they carried it forward with the same honest, hard-working integrity they'd brought to every day of their ordinary lives, and in doing so, they became extraordinary. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe ordinary people can change the world.